So I'd like to introduce our speaker today, and I'm sort of partly responsible for him being here. Let me just quickly explain why that is. I know of his father's art, and I hate to put it upon you to live in the shadow of a parent. I don't, but it's a good thing in this case. And I had learned that he was speaking at Northern Westchester last spring, and so I played hooky from here and went up to Northern Westchester because I was really interested to hear what he would have to say. And I was really glad that I did. And my wife was then chair of the committee that recruits speakers here and said, see if he's a good speaker. So I spoke to him and he said he'd be glad to come here, which I'm very glad that he is too. Marc Fasanella, and you will talk about your father's art, I presume, so I won't go into that. Marc Fasanella is going to be giving us an illustrated lecture that introduces seminal concepts of how humanity can engage with and implement ecologically enlightened, artful, advanced concepts of community development and land use. No amount of innovation is equal to a bit of insightful memory. No amount of green technology based upon resources extracted and rendered through long extraction, production, distribution, consumption, and disposal systems can equal the efficiency and effectiveness of local adaptation, ingenuity, and resilience. And much of what he's going to talk about today, and I know because I've heard a similar talk, is going to focus on that. But Marc has a PhD, it's Dr. Marc Fasanella, from NYU in art and environmental design. He was a professor of architecture, art, and ecology, I guess, as well as graphic design for 30 years. He's also worked as an art director, curator, and design build specialist in wood and landscape. He left academia to found an environmental nonprofit, and now works as a freelance creative consultant. And I can assure you that he is very creative, and his work is marvelous. So, Marc, welcome.
Thank you. Appreciate it. So, oh, that's right. So this is my very inexpensive technical assistant with a Yale PhD and 2 books out by Oxford University Press. But she comes cheap because we're married. There we go. Okay, so I have a lot to say. It's mostly spoken through images, although I will be accompanying it with words. So you really want to pay attention to the screen, as charismatic as I might be. But because really the pictures tell the images. I'm going to go fast, but I will try to enunciate as much as possible, because there's a lot to get to. So this is a quote that I got from my father. Remember who you are, remember where you came from, don't forget the past, change the world. He didn't come up with that phrase. It's been around. I don't know where he got it, but he used to say it all the time. And of course, that was a big thing to live up to as a child growing up. It's on his tombstone. But I went on a different path. He was a visual artist. He was a self-taught visual artist. His work is in the Metropolitan Museum. It's in the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Fenimore Art Museum in Cooperstown, and the American Folk Art Museum. At the back of the room, next to the refreshments, I have cards. And if anybody emails me, you can find me easily online. One that describes my father a bit more, and one that describes me a bit more, so you can always pick one of those up. But when I came into the world and I did all of this studying about how human beings connect to the built environment, that's been the main focus of my life, I realized that we have not evolved that much from this person. I did try to find a male and female illustration. I couldn't find a good one of a Paleolithic couple that wasn't really cartoony. And during the pandemic, my wife said, why don't you grow your beard? And I did. It got to about this long. And I didn't do any personal grooming, and I wasn't too far off. And the ponytail is the only remnant of that. And this is the environment that we lived in for the longest time. This is actually Białowieża forest in Poland, Ukraine. In fact, it's probably been terribly destroyed because the Ukrainians were using it for target practice, and before that, they were housing migrants that they didn't want to get into Poland and other places, and they let them loose in the forest. But it is one of the only primeval forests in the world, the only one that existed in Europe. And that's the context. It's very marshy. There's a lot of what they call decadence, a tremendous amount of falling trees and standing water. Not a place that we would consider a comfortable landscape to live in, but it was incredibly comfortable for these people because it was a giant grocery store. And they actually got They ate, the Germans, they were really, the diet, the predecessor to the Germans, their diet was based on acorns, and they resisted Roman invasions because the Romans showed up with chariots and armor and tried to get through that. And it didn't work because the locals were up in trees and throwing rocks and bows and arrows at them. So this quote says, "Our phenotype, an innate drive to alter ecosystems, create a built environment." The phenotype is how a species, how a being exists in its environment and creates and controls its environment. So birds build nests, etc. Think about human beings. We have this impulse, this restless drive. It's innate. We can't stop from creating, even when we try to. And of course, now it's reached the point where we realize it's incredibly destructive, our creation. It's creative destruction because we're running out of ecosystem. I just read a story about wolves that are no longer able to come down from Canada into upstate New York because the ecosystem has been so altered. There aren't patches for them to get one. Of course, they need that for biodiversity. Migration is an essential part of biodiversity. The species become inbred if they don't have other members of that species immigrating. So at our most benign state, we lived in this type of environment, which if you look at it, this is actually Madagascar from 2010. And you can see a little cottage and some banana trees and early agriculture. People were still living that way in Madagascar in 2010. Unfortunately, a Stony Brook researcher and many other people kind of popularized Madagascar, and it's now got ecotourism, which is an incredibly destructive force. Because people who go on ecotourism, even though they want to go see the environment, they also want sugary drinks and delicious meals, and it changes the nature of accommodations. It, of course, drives up the prices of land and pushes people off their indigenous land. But that's when we lived the most benign, the most sustainably. If you're really looking for a sustainable way to live, that would be it. And I'm not saying we should go back there. Very quickly, if you think about ancient Egypt, which is 4,000 years ago, the Nile was a fertile valley full of tropical plants and tropical animals. It wasn't desertified by some catastrophic natural act. It was desertified because the Egyptian empire became so big, it overexpanded its use of resources, and it's still a desert. And of course now there's a whole fight over the water coming down the Nile, and it'll be even more desertified because there's a dam being built, and so you have to think about this cycle of human creation, destruction, empire growth, and collapse. This is ancient Rome. So for that time period, it's a megacity. And if you think about all the resources that Rome, had conquered so many places, not those early Germanic peoples, but they had conquered so many places, and they had to keep standing armies in each one of them, and the resources became so monumental for them to keep those armies fed, to keep the local population part of Rome, that once again it collapsed. And there's all kinds of theories, but essentially it collapsed of its own weight, like ancient Egypt did. This is medieval England. This is Chester. Those are actually 5-story buildings. Now, in the 19th century, a lot of England was restored. In fact, a fellow who changed my life, William Morris, who was a 19th century designer, scholar, philosopher, poet. Anyway, he founded the first Society for Historic Preservation because so many buildings from this time were being altered in ways that rendered them very different. So I can't guarantee that that's exactly what Chester looked like in the Middle Ages, but that one was originally built. 5-story buildings, walkable, pedestrian, mixed use, all of the things they say about how do you make a viable, sustainable community. And this is the type of agriculture that supported it. This is a Bruegel painting called The Harvesters. But you can see, if you look in the background, it's very much like farming is in upstate New York today, and it wasn't actually all that great for the environment. In fact, Europe, as you got into the age of exploration, had taken down that's one of the reasons when they found the New World, they were shipping oak and pine, huge trees there, because all of the wood to build the hulls of ships out of oak and the masts out of pine had been harvested, all of those big trees all over Europe. So they were shipping them from the New World there. So it wasn't really all that. We see it as this bucolic kind of perfect setting. And of course, in many places in Europe, they're still doing this scale of farming, using machinery, but then there were huge protests about not allowing produce from other areas to come in and ruin the local farming market, because it would, as it has in the United States. But very quickly, going into the French empire, you see this, which is Versailles. I've never been there, but I've shown a presentations about Versailles to so many students, I feel like I have been there. But this is where we just drove through Prospect Park, and there's big fountains and that's where we got that aesthetic from. It's an emulation. If you think of an American wedding, it's an emulation of a medieval wedding, right? On Long Island, where we live now, it is called the Wedding Industrial Complex. I actually went to a wedding once where the bride's parents lost their business, they owned a diner, and their house over the cost of the wedding. So that's because they're emulating royalty, which of course is a form of madness and creative destruction because of the resource that goes with the amount of food that's produced and then thrown away, because of course you have to have seconds and thirds and hors d'oeuvres and desserts. So this shows you the scale of Versailles, and it's kind of hard to see. I will walk over the screen. But this here, these are just the gardens. This here, I can use my mouse, is the city that was necessary to, this over here was the city that was necessary to maintain it. These are all apartment buildings behind, this is Versailles, these are all apartment houses behind Versailles, because when you maintain a garden like that, when the only gardening tools are scissors and saws and axes, and there's all this topiary, all that stuff we identify now, and we'll get there. Our suburban lawns comes from this context, which of course was basically based on indentured servitude and slave labor. Then back to England, in the 19th century, you're looking at these bucolic, these are the first parks that were made in the world. They were actually English minor nobles, because nobility had, people have children, and because of the first law of primogeniture, only the firstborn son would get most of the money, but of course some other people got ennobled, or they had other offspring, and so you had all these nobles with these little spots that they lived in, little villages they lived in, and they had a lot of land, and they created parks, so places that they could go where those are not ancient Roman structures or Greek structures, those are whimsies for their garden, like putting a gnome. There's little small scale versions of them, but you get the idea. And we still have that concept. We got to have our lawn and a fountain in it and a topiary, and all of that's there. But very quickly, all over Europe, it got to this scale. This is Alperbeck in Germany, because the industrial era came in with the 19th century. Really, the 1700s is really when all of this, the looms and mills and all that spinning happened, and you had factory towns along the waterways using to run all the looms. And then it got Germany, still famous for chemistry, and you get these cities that the farms ran right up to, you have the city here, you have the farms outside the city, which is the model that we see, and then the factories ran over the farms, and of course this is polluting the air and polluting the crops, and we're still in that cycle, if you think about it. We're still very much in that cycle. So this is why I called this presentation The Art of Social Fabric. It's a long quote, and I'll read it to you. I must ask you to extend the word art beyond these works that are consciously works of art, to take in not only painting, sculpture, and architecture, all household goods, arrangements of fields for tillage and pasture, the management of towns and highways, to extend artfulness to all the externals of our life. I must ask you to believe that every one of the things that goes to make up the surroundings amongst which we must live be either elevating or degrading, either a torment and a burden to the maker of it to make, or a pleasure, a solace. So that is William Morris in the 19th century, at the time when they were putting rail lines, tunneling through mountains to put in rail lines. And there's another quote, where they were skiing down the hills of Schafflaus and people sliding, like bears sliding down grease poles. Like, we created that ecotourism then, where people were going up into the mountains. And he's saying, no, we need to take time and think about the world that we live in as a project of artfulness, not greed, lust, consumption, blah, blah, blah. So he wasn't the only person. This is Ebenezer Howard. It's kind of a very rudimentary diagram, but this is a city, this is a city, this is a city, this is a city. And he was trying to figure out, like, how could you geometrically connect cities with rail lines? And there are he created the Garden City concept. And of course, there's Garden City, New Jersey. There are other garden cities around the world. And you can see he gets to, like, there's a Grand Avenue, Boulevard. And so a lot of this is still used in urban planning. And it's part of Chicago, of course, the Burnham plan in Chicago. They still have this street where you know exactly where you're in the city because of the grid numbers, and there are other places where these ideas were used. But this is what Ebenezer Howard was shooting for. This is the kind of Garden City housing he was looking for. There's a little front garden for flowers, a little small garden in the back to grow vegetables. That is workers' housing. Like that was his concept. In fact, if you think about Forest Hills, that comes directly from this movement. But then, of course, it became middle-class housing. Although the original design of Forest Hills was an experiment in, believe this or not, cast concrete construction by Grosvenor Atterbury to make cheaper housing. So a lot of them were built out of cast. They look like Tudors, but they were built as cast concrete construction. So what happens after that in the 19th century? We have the wars, the cars, and suburbia. My wife and I just drove through Levittown. There's one here in New Jersey, and we drove through the one on Long Island. Of course, it looks nothing like this now because people have put additions on the house and the trees have grown up and whatever. But you can see that they're literally planting houses like crops. And it's still going on, you're going to see. But that wasn't the only idea at the time. Frank Lloyd Wright created this, which is a Usonian concept. So if you look at this, all of the plots are round, the roads go along the curves, and the idea is that on the edges of all the properties, nobody maintains the land. So it's just this kind of one contiguous forest with housing in it. And even these lots that were sold to members of Usonia, this exists in Westchester County. And when I spoke at the Ethical Culture Society in Westchester County, Roland Risley, who was a member of the Ethical Culture Society for years, he had just turned 80 or 90, or 100. He had just turned 100. I used to take students to this Usonia in Westchester County, and he would tour us around, and he worked with Frank Lloyd Wright on this. You'll see his house, actually. So that's the plot, and that's the house. There's just an article about him not too long ago, because he turned 100. So you can see Wright was thinking about something at the very same time as Levittown, very different, trying to propose for America. And Frank Lloyd Wright was really seen as the quintessential American architect more than anyone else, because he was trying to create this new style of architecture that didn't derive from Europe, that didn't derive from the Bauhaus, that didn't derive from World War II, was something that was organically connected to the landscape of where it made. And that's why he created two different schools to train architects, Taliesin East and Taliesin West, because the architecture should look different. It should relate to the place that it emanated from and evolved from. And of course, at the same time, you had Mies van der Rohe. And he had a very different concept of eschewing decoration and modernism and a modern life and linoleum and stainless steel and clean houses and a kind of efficiency of construction. These eventually became very expensive houses, and they're still being built as very expensive houses. But the idea is that you were simplifying the materials and the design to get rid of all that bric-a-brac from the 19th century and the overly decorous environments. But what we ended up with, mass writ large, was a weird mix of the two. And I've lived in many houses like this. In fact, I now live in a tumble-down cottage that we're slowly fixing up. That has no elegance whatsoever. So I'm not being a snob, but I'm just saying we ended up with this weird mix of the two because the architects in school at that time got both of these ideas, graduated, worked in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and this is what they were building. Then they got into postmodernism, but this is really what comes out of that era. So it's neither. It's not really connected to the landscape. You see these houses built everywhere. You see the other houses built everywhere. The materials aren't related to the landscape. It doesn't create this environment. And now this is what we're getting. This is Henderson, Nevada. In year 2000, a house was completed every 20 minutes. And this was happening in Canada. It was happening all over the United States. It was happening in China. That's in China. And so what happened was, of course, there was a huge housing boom. And China's still suffering the repercussions of that. They built whole eco-cities. They didn't even have the population for them, but they knew the population was going to grow, so they built eco-cities, which were horribly wasteful of materials, and but not so eco. But and then there was a bust in it, and they pushed people off their land. At the same time, because of our desire to create, you can see what happened. This is Manhattan. This is a project done by Eric Sanderson, who works out of New York City. He's now finishing up Queens and Brooklyn. But this is what Manhattan looked like prior to colonization and what its aftermath. And this is what I mean by creative destruction. So you can see how, and I'll show you more than once, how much more land there is. All of those parks, we just drove along them. We moved my daughter from Upper Manhattan to Brooklyn yesterday from 6 a.m. until 1:45 in the morning. So we drove along all the parks that are along, and they're building parks right here now, actually. And they're displacing water to do it. They're green parks, and I actually have a good friend who is a project manager who puts in all the plants in those parks, but they're displacing water. They're making the river narrower, the Newark Harbor smaller, as you'll see. And of course, this is what's happening in the desert. And I was talking to a woman the other day, a friend of my daughter's, and she said, oh, it's terrible. We just went to California, to Los Angeles, and the coyotes are coming in. They're eating people's pets. That was a real happening because they are eating people's pets. But the reason the coyotes are coming in is because we keep building more and more of those types of developments in the desert. So, of course, the coyotes are becoming like raccoons are and possums are and deer are on Long Island. They're completely suburbanized. They live in little tiny quarter-acre, eighth-acre lots, whole families of deer, and they come right into everybody's backyard. So in 1810, 3% of the population was urban. Most of those people who were not urban were farmers or blacksmiths. Or, you know, they were working with their hands out in the fields and very connected to nature, very connected to the environment. By 2010, 50% of the population is urban and increasing. The population is now 8 billion and rising. This is a chart looking at population from 2000, projecting to 2031. I double-checked the math last week. It's spot on. Like it's just going up, 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 up. And you can see the different countries. The United States, North America is the blue, so it's the highest population growth. Some of which comes from immigration, but you can really see our population is just going steadily up. And what's proposed as a solution, and what I taught in sustainability, all of my colleagues, and Stony Brook is involved in this big project on Randall's Island, Governor's Island. Governor's Island, they're going to rebuild Governor's Island. I was going to show that picture. But they were making Governor's Island even bigger than it was and adding more riprap and displacing more water. It's not really a sustainable solution, neither is this. It's what I call, a good friend of mine called limousine green. It's really, it's not, most of the world's population right now today is either living in dirt houses, houses made out of dirt, or tents because there are so many displaced. It's really, it's crazy. This is a picture of Dubai, which looks very different now. This is an article from 2010. They're now building whole luxury communities with golf courses and air-conditioned, you know, indoor tennis courts and swimming pools and huge gyms and everything. This is all completed. It's all green and everything. There are no resources there. I mean, there are species, there are animals that are adapted to that ecosystem, but there is no iron. There's oil. But there's no iron, there's no copper, there's no Portland cement. All of that stuff has to be shipped there. It is the most unsustainable act in the world to create a city like Dubai. This is Mexico City, which is the world's largest city. It may have been overtaken. Some of my statistics are from 2010. And you can see the air quality. It's also now, of course, one of the most dangerous cities in the world. I don't know if you heard about the Sinaloa cartel and the battles they've been having between two factions of it. And of course, all of those guns are being made by, most of them are being made by American gun manufacturers. And what I always say is, we got into the opioid scandal because it was clear that there were more opioids being produced than prescriptions. Well, how many gun licenses are given out? And how many guns are produced? Well, there's something wrong with this picture. And this is how, in cities, most people live, in the world's megacities. Although Toronto's become a mega city, we drove through Manhattan last night, along the side of Manhattan. We could see it, and it is such a dystopian megacity now compared to the city of my youth. And I just turned 60. So it's just growing and growing. The scale of the buildings get higher. We tear down more and more. But a lot of people live in favelas like this. That are really just shacks. Lagos, Nigeria, which is one of the biggest cities in the world. So it's great. You can see the Manhattan prior to Dutch colonization and Manhattan now. And as I said, it's expanding. So, the New York Harbor floods. Surprise, surprise. How could it not flood? We just drove along the West Side Highway, looked to the right, and the water level was higher than the roadway on the West Side Highway. That's why it floods all the time. Surprise, surprise. We keep making the room for the water to expand smaller. So what's necessary? A change in how we perceive and value nature. And we have to embrace this concept, which is totally counter to what everybody is saying, degrowth. We need to have less growth in all things. That is the answer. And we have to get over hubris, and I'll explain how we might get there. And we have to disavow exceptionalism. Hubris, thinking that we are somehow a superior species. We're not that superior if we keep this model of expand, collapse. Expand, collapse. That's not such superior thinking. And exceptionalism, that somehow we can, I remember President Obama saying, I'm not worried about environmental climate change because human innovation will always rise to the challenge. Just look at our past. It didn't rise to the challenge for the Egyptians, for the Romans, for the British, for the French. So those colonies collapsed. So this is Singapore. Let's put my glasses down. Singapore, I believe. In the 1950s, yeah, Singapore. In the 1950s, in the 1980s and the 2000s. So this is what I mean about water displacement. And Singapore is considered one of the greenest, most sustainable countries on earth. It can't be. It's impossible. It was unsustainable from this growth of displacing water. So the concept that's necessary is the use of bioregionalism, a political, cultural, and environmental system based on naturally defined areas. Features such as watershed boundaries, as well as soil, terrain characteristics. A bioregion is a cultural phenomenon of local knowledge and solutions, which of course through globalization we are completely erasing. So for instance, I took 3 groups of students to Costa Rica, 2 to study permaculture. Ann and I were on one of those trips, and we went through community, and my daughter was on one of the trips. And the locals, the older people there were saying the young generation does not know how to go into the forest and find plants that are used for a headache, for an upset stomach, for any number of conditions you could go into the rainforest. When my daughter and I went, there were horrific rainstorms. We had to eat out of the forest, which we did for a month. And she got this horrible infection on her foot. I thought she was going to lose her leg. She cut the bottom of her foot on some dirty coral. I thought she was going to lose at least up to her calf. And there was a woman there. We couldn't get her. We would have had to put her on horseback in a storm. There was no way to take her out boat and go on a 2-hour or an hour and a half ride on horseback to a local clinic that probably wouldn't have had them. Anyway, she kept her foot using turmeric and all of these. There's a woman who was an herbal specialist there, and I was shocked. But that's what you mean by local cultural knowledge. And that's how you live sustainably in landscape. Not going backwards, going forwards intelligently. So they knew when they rebuilt after Sandy, this is a plan made right after Sandy, Hurricane Sandy. They knew that all of these buildings, every one that you see kind of ghosted in the background, those foundations are totally unsustainable. They are sitting on landfill. There is no bedrock under them. Manhattan's known for the skyscrapers whose bedrock. There is none. And that's why they found a slave ship underneath the Freedom Tower, underneath the World Trade Center, because it's landfill. They were throwing boats into it to displace water. So those are all unsustainable buildings. And this was a plan. So how could we deal with the water influx that's going to happen? It's putting oyster reefs, and there's this fantastic woman, she didn't necessarily come up with that last drawing, named Kate Orff, and this is her way of explaining, as a landscape architect, she teaches at Columbia University, has a company called Scape. The oyster accepts algae and detritus in one end, and through this beautiful, glamorous stomach's organs, out the other end comes cleaner water. The climate crisis is a leadership crisis about more than cutting carbon and proceeding with business as usual. It's about understanding the ecosystems that would actually create a seawall, which was there. The cheapest thing to eat in New York in the 1800s was oyster stew, because there were so many oysters in the bottom of the New York harbor. And those were killed by pollution and displacement of their. So this is one of Kate Orff's plans. These are all oyster reefs to take all of that area. And there's this project that is being built out in Tottenville, Staten Island, because of course Staten Island was devastated, and they created what was called the Blue Belt there, where they actually knocked down tons of houses, just bought them from the people, and put in waterways so that doesn't happen again, because there has to be some place for the water to go. And this is the problem. Housing's worth the most, retail the next, industrial land the next, recreational land the next, agriculture is worth, so prices go down until raw nature. You want to go buy a piece of land, you can go to upstate New York and get one for $100,000, 150 acres, right? So in certain places, it's getting expensive in places. This is Manhattan, and it's worse now. It's really overbuilt. You can see that. The buildings keep getting taller, and this is Long Island and a lot of New Jersey. Nothing on this entire lot is native. Nothing comes from the land. Those are cultured stone. They're made out of plastic. It's vinyl siding that is made in factories that produce esophageal cancer for the workers, and they were cutting it with woodworking saws, and all the dust is going everywhere. And then there's our yards, which are using fungicides and petrochemical fertilizers, and it's going down storm drains as fast as it can directly to our waterways and our local aquifers, which is all based upon this notion that we should live like royalty. So I'm saying we should go forward intelligently. Ian McHarg in 1972 came up with that concept of bioregionalism and did all of these maps to show how we could find where the watersheds are, where's the most fertile soil, where should we put housing that would do the least. That was all mapped in 1970s at Penn State University with Ian McHarg, and we're not doing that. And of course, this could be our yards. You could make a living. This is a market garden property. I think it is in a tropical environment, maybe Florida, but that's a whole market garden property. Like they're selling produce from a half or quarter acre lot. And then, of course, this is the other option, which is what I'm doing at our property, is called xeriscaping. Trying to put in plants. They do take time. I spend a lot of time pulling weeds and trimming things to keep them from overtaking the property. But this is called xeriscaping, where once it's established, it's kind of, and of course, there's totally different ways of looking at it. It's a project by a firm in Europe called Site, or actually they're based in the United States, Sculpture in the Environment. And you can see there's a building back here, which is actually very hard to see. And this is a pavilion. And then you can live above the land, and they are building houses like this. This is the best way to live, where the whole ecosystem is undeveloped. You might have a septic tank, you might have a well, or be connected to public water, but you're actually living, the house is floating above the land. And this is the other problem. This is 1950, and this is 2006, and they're getting even bigger. The size of the house per person. And this is Woodrow Wilson's house that he was born and raised in for just the first few years of his life. I think there were 4 people living in this house, and it was 200 square feet. Ann and I live in a 600 square foot cottage, but we need more space. And this is what's being proposed as an affordable housing solution. We saw them all over the West Coast. I went out to visit my son who lives in Olympia, Washington. And this is a tiny house. It's not a solution. A tiny house is a way around a solution, because instead of adjusting the building codes to create affordable housing, you're saying, well, this isn't a house, it's on a trailer wheel, so it doesn't fit into the building code, so it's an exception. Trailer parks are actually the same thing. Trailer parks are not built. A friend of mine lives in a trailer park. He opened up the ceiling, and there's 2x2s. You can't build a house with 2x2s. They're built to be temporary. That's why they're on wheels, and they put them up on blocks and take. They're not a housing solution. They're a way around our notion of what housing solutions are, to get around the codes. What we should be doing, especially in the Northeast and temperate climates, is building passive solar housing. Passive solar housing, if you just made a building code change that every new house and every renovation, major renovation on a house, has to make use of passive solar design, you would have an immediately, you build a passive solar house, it never needs an adjustment, a technician. You know, maybe the window glass will fog, but other than that, it's built, it works forever. This is what the interior looks like. This is a house built by a friend of mine, Bill Chaloff, although we haven't spoken in many years. It's a very beautiful interior. Very simple concept. The salt boxes built by the colonists in the Northeast were passive solar houses. A salt box has a long roof on one side, a short roof on the other, with a lot of windows, and almost no windows in the back. The south side, it has all the windows. The kitchen's at the back with that long roof. You have the stove in the kitchen, heats up the kitchen, heats up the rest of the house, and the sun comes in the daytime. It's a passive solar house. And all of the streets were oriented by the colonists to take advantage of that. So that's a building code that you can simply change. What are we building? Cul-de-sacs, which do not make use of that. In fact, research was done, and the most sustainable, community-oriented, sustainable in terms of a community housing is actually houses that have alleys in between them, because the kids can play, the garages are back there, the garbage is there. I look out my front window, because we have a road on both sides of our cottage. Either one, most of the week I'm looking at garbage pails, tons of Amazon boxes. That's what the front of the house is lined with. You know, it's just garbage, because of course everybody's getting shipped now. So what we need to do is rethink housing. So instead of talking about housing starts and growth, we're talking about self-build, people creating, instead of purpose-built buildings. So in other words, if you go back to those colonists and those, and I'm not saying it was a perfect time, the colonial era, that was one of the worst genocides in the world. It was at least 10 million indigenous people living on this land were eradicated. So I'm not saying that that was some kind of a panacea at that time. But when somebody built a building, it could be used as a pharmacist's office, the doctor's office, a house. Like it was the same building, a Cape Cod-style house, a salt box was used for all the, now we make purpose-built buildings. It's a Home Depot, goes out of business. Nobody wants that space. It's too big for any other business, right? Or too small for a new Home Depot. So they're purpose-built. These are reclaimed, so I'm just going to show an example of one I knew. This is a barn that a former colleague of mine bought in upstate New York. He drove by it. He'd been doing it for a while. He looked around. They definitely weren't using the barn. He knocked on the farmer's door. I said, using that barn? He said, no, we haven't used it in 30 years. He said, can I have it? And the guy said, what do you mean? He said, well, I'll just come pay to take it down. I'll pay you for the barn. So he did. And they trucked it all to a new lot in Southampton, rebuilt it, and he made his house out of it. And there are barns sitting in warehouses now that have been deconstructed, waiting to be built. But we're not doing that in our building codes, right? We're not doing passive solar. We're not saying reuse a building that's totally reusable because it's too expensive, because you can go to Home Depot and buy almost all plastic products for your new house. Except for the 2x4s or the studs, which are metal, the insulation is plastic. The flooring is plastic. This is plastic flooring. Like, everything's being replaced with plastic, and they're saying it's cheaper. Why is it cheaper? Because we're fighting wars over the oil. We're subsidizing it through our tax dollars and through giving money to arms manufacturers. So this is how we can go back into communities. So this is a place where there was maybe a few houses, maybe a half-acre lot each, merge the lots and add new houses, and that's what that community looks like. There's an architect that builds communities like this. So you can see there's the main house and then little cottages in the backyard that are not tiny houses. They're real houses. They're not on wheels. They might have a basement. They have their own water heater. You know, they're not using pellets that are waste products from I went out to visit my son in Olympia, Washington. The clear cutting all over the Oregon and Washington and up in Canada and they're making pellets out of the waste products. It's like the oil industry. It's not necessarily the most sustainable use of land. There's another example. There's the main house, two houses. They merge the lots and they create, so it's called infill development. That's what these look like. So we have the solutions. All of the solutions are there. I got to speed up. So if you think about it, I said before, Egypt collapsed, Greece collapsed, Rome collapsed. In the Middle Ages, you had the Dark Age, coming out of the Dark Ages, the Renaissance city, and we got to the Garden City. And people say, oh my God, where climate change is going to, there may be some catastrophic event. However, Egypt collapsed, there are still Egyptians. Greece collapsed, there are still Greeks. Rome collapsed, there are still Romans, right? There are still British people, there are still French people. The collapse means that paradigm of seeing yourself as exceptionalist, that we are the most powerful, we are the greatest nation on earth, God bless us. That paradigm collapses. And there have been many studies that have lived alongside those, many cultures that have lived alongside those empires that did not ascribe to those hubristic exceptionalist principles. They didn't get written about because they didn't make monumental architecture. They didn't do human sacrifice, right? And there was a great book called The Dawn of Everything that describes those communities, because those scholars didn't get the big grants. They didn't get published in the major journals. So go back, Chester. This is still happening. This is in Northern Virginia. I forget where this is from, but you get the idea. All of the concepts from the Middle Ages, from an early Roman city that was sustainable, we can build them. They're 3-, 4-, 5-story architecture. It's walkable. You see how much nicer it is when there are no cars parked there, right? You can park on the outskirts and walk around or push someone around in a wheelchair or scoot around. When you get the cars in, it changes but this is the characteristic of a sustainable community. It's not that green thing you saw with all the green roofs and everything, because that's all new materials and new resources, and it's not infill development. It's not building into the culture that was over there. So over every 30 years, we rebuild most of the architecture in the world, 75% of it, but especially in North America. We tear it down or we renovate it beyond recognition over the course of 30 years. So what an opportunity to make it passive solar, to make it something that's using reclaimed materials instead of new materials, local materials. And originally LEED was meant for that. This is Detroit, right? Detroit is having a whole resurgence now, but this is what's at its worst. And so we can rebuild those houses. The houses are there. That solar architect you saw, the interior of his house, he had a quote he always used to say, the most sustainable house is the one you don't build. So here's another example with the ecological part of it. So this is Prague, and this is my just finding a random image on the internet, like what could you do with this street, right? It looks like a lot of streets, but we just drove through this all over Brooklyn and in Upper Manhattan and the Bronx, like it looks like this. You could do this. Right? That's just infill development. It's just going back into the place and reclaiming it. So what do we have to do is embrace decay, because this is about keeping everything clean and neat and orderly. And this is about saying, no, we want decay, because decay creates growth, right? We want to use composting and have soils and all kinds of decay. And that's, of course, really what we're trying to emulate. And we need to have all of these things, mycorrhizal fungi. I farm mycorrhizal fungi. I try to under the land with wood chips and blah, blah, blah. But this is connected by miles from under the ground, connects oak trees and other plants and communicates. If you pour you know, if you drain the oil in your car and you dump it on the ground, it will actually, the mycorrhizae will send signals through the, into the oak trees. And they actually have been books about how trees can talk. And it's not so much that they talk, but they are sending communications about where to send their sugars. And, you know, there's nurse logs, and there's oak trees, as they die, they send all of their nutrients to younger trees that are around them. So there's a great book called Finding the Mother Tree. So these are the things that we have to think about. And detritivores, you have to have reptiles and amphibians in the ecosystem. We have woodpeckers. And then we see, oh, it's a terrible, terrible pest. What's the solution to this terrible, terrible pest? Not our solution. We're going to use birth control for deer. That's the solution they're using very often now. They're using birth control for deer. Coyotes control the deer population. They eat the young, and then it reduces the population. But then to have more biodiversity, we have to create these. These are called ecological corridors. And so you can see this is not for cars. You could walk over it, but it's to get bears, deer, possums. Roadkill is actually a significant cause of species decline. There's a tremendous amount of roadkill as we go more and more. And then we have to really think about our waterways. So this is a standard sewer. What we need to be doing is creating what are called bioswales. That's a bioswale. Okay? And you can see the lawn in the background as opposed to the plants that actually soak up the water. And that's what they're doing in these parks. I was saying along Long Island City and Brooklyn, and now on the west side of Manhattan. They're actually creating these kinds of things. New Jersey, if you don't know this, sued New York over the pollution in the New York harbor and forced New York in court, might have been the Supreme Court, to put in bioswales to reduce the amount of street pollution. So this is a great parking lot at the Parrish Art Museum. And then this is Central Park, which has more soil biodiversity of any park in New York State. And it's because of the way it's being managed now. This is what you can do with a landfill. This is actually in New Jersey somewhere. This is called Society for Ecological Restoration. And that's what it looks like after the fact, after it's restored. This is one of my favorite projects by a guy named John Todd. It's a horrible, filthy river in China. He walked around, found plants that were growing in the most disgusting places, cultivated them, put in this mats that you see here, and then now it's a popular place to walk. And they use the existing infrastructure. Instead of drilling through all those walls, as ancient Chinese cities, they're floating the wires. You can see these things. They're floating the wires and things, you know, on the top of the river. So that's a sewage treatment plant using only plants John Todd invented. So he said the solution depends on us becoming attuned to the natural world. We must shed our hubris, become integral with the resources which sustain us. Our only hope for a transition to a stable future is one in which we embrace the best of indigenous traditions and wisdoms and integrate them with biology and ecology. These provide the template for human survival. And he doesn't only mean Native American. There are indigenous traditions in Europe. There are indigenous traditions on every square inch of the earth. I got to rush through some of this because I do take a long time. So this is a sewage treatment plant in China. That's what it looks like. A huge one for a giant condo development. And this is Konyan Yu, who Ian McHarg invented bioregionalism at Penn State with his graduate students. Konyan Yu was one of those graduate students. And he now has the biggest landscape. He's the first person in the world to get a PhD or doctorate in landscape. And he's now got a huge company in China. And he says China's doing everything right and everything wrong. He's, of course, prevented all kinds of flooding of rivers with that kind of development. But this is what he says. The new language of ecological design should be native in terms of the material and plant use. For the common people, we should not consider this high culture, like the parks we should address the issue of survival, not pleasure-making or ornament, because we are now, as human beings, at the edge of survival. Our surface water has been polluted. The underground water is dropping. That's an issue of survival. The new vernacular design is different from, but draws upon the old agricultural vernacular design. For 5,000 years, agriculture developed, adapted to the land and its people. So we keep trying to adapt agriculture to people, right? We're not trying to adapt the agriculture to the land and the people. It's the other way around. So I'm going to go through some of this. Why should we do this? Because of the fish kills. My son, who just walked in because he had to drop something off at a hotel, took this picture, or he called me right away and he said, why isn't everybody freaking out like it's the day after 9/11? This was a fish kill in a canal in Hampton Bays where we lived at the time on Long Island, and all the local politicians and some of the marine biologists said, oh, it was natural causes. There were low levels of oxygen in the water. Well, if you look at the sides of this waterway, it is completely hemmed in by concrete. Of course there's no oxygen in the water. And there's a ton of marinas where people wash their boats and pump out their boats illegally. So yes, the fish were going to die. It was not natural causes. This is how we get our lithium. This is a lithium mine. One of my former students is now doing PhD work on all of the ecosystems that live in that desert. All of the biology that live in that desert. Dan Doherty. So that's his illustration of this cycle is what creates the pink and flamingos, and that's what they're doing to it in lithium mining. And these are mostly Chinese companies. And of course, they're pushing out all that local ecology and leaving behind a horrible toxic landfill. This is how our tantalum, our coltan for our cell phones and many of our computers comes. It's children going into holes or smashing up rocks with no safety equipment. And then we create all this e-waste, and then we ship it over to Agloshi e-waste dump, and they burn off all the plastics to get at the precious metals so we can recycle them. And a lot of recycling is done like this everywhere in the world. And of course, it results in this in China and India and blah, blah, blah. And of course, this is a waterway where you can walk on the plastic. And there are many of those. And these are albatrosses that live on Midway Island where we tested nuclear bombs in the United States. It's full of albatrosses that are full of plastics. Chris Jordan is a great photographer who did a whole series and made a great film. And this is the plastics that we're putting in the ecosystem every day. This is me working on my house with a mason. He said, can you cut this wood for me, this material for me? I cut it. This is like 2 boards that we cut, had to cut slots in or whatever, and it created all of this dust. That's the microplastics. Number 1 particulate in the air is microplastics. Number 1 particulate in the water is microplastics. Because our dryer lint has tons of microplastics. So this is, I'm winding down, this is the crux of it. And this is an old diagram from National Geographic. Human impact times population times affluence times technology creates the human impact. It's our population times affluence times technology. So Canada, even though it's a smaller population, is the most unsustainable place on Earth right now because of their consumption habits and their building development habits. United States comes in second, I believe. I'm sure China's in there too. So we have to have these different concepts. We're not imposing on the landscape, we're integrating with the environment, but even more so we're collaborating. So our agriculture has to go from this to this. Our farms have to look more like this, which were completely sustainable farms. I'm going to go through this. Our schools have to be teaching people how to grow plants. This is the edible schoolyard movement. And we have to deal with these concepts. What is the actual truth to this issue? How do we reconcile with our own creative discussion? How do we remediate what we have damaged, and how do we give reparations, not just to peoples, but also to the ecosystem, to the coyotes, to the frogs? Like, how do we give reparation to that? And of course, in many places now, rivers have gotten personhood for that reason, because they deserve it. And then we don't need to mitigate. We have to immediately. Mitigating meaning we deal with the problem. We're going to go down to North Carolina, we're going to go down to the Cedar Key, and we're going to rebuild, and we're going to mitigate the problem. We're going to put a seawall, we're going to put all those parks along Manhattan, but we're not adapting to the actual situation at hand. The actual situation at hand is that we made the river narrower and the New York Harbor smaller, so there's less for the water to go. We need to adapt to that situation, not mitigate it. And then we can have a position of resilience, true resilience. So I have all kinds of, these are the questions that people will ask, what do we do? These are the things we would do. And I could send you this presentation, this list. There you see it, right? I see it from planes now. That's it. You can see where the money is, right? You can see where, right there. You can see where everybody's flying, what ecotourism has done. Those are the flights. These are the lights. And these both have been, so you don't need to be a scientist to understand this, right? It's clearly there. We're flying too much and we have too many lights on. So I'm just going to go past this. So Buckminster Fuller created this map. It's the only map that you can actually accurately measure the continents on, because we do not live on a globe like a Mercator map that you just saw, where Iceland is giant, where it's stretched out because it's cut out. It's actually, this is a geodesic dome it folds up to. And you can really see we live on one island and one ocean. That's why when Fukushima happened, Harley Davidson washed up in Alaska. It's one ocean. So anyway, you get regenerative design, and this is what people always say, what should we be doing? So our personal care, local food, compost, permascaping, rain harvest, making use of the water I showed, nature sanctuaries, historic preservation, reusing things, keeping a cultural identity, ecocentrism instead of egocentrism, conscious consumption, conscious consumption. So those are all the principles we should be using. So this is my epitaph, I hope, is remember the past, although I don't want a gravestone. Remember the past, understand the present, and envision the future. And unlike Biden, I'm not going to say it's hopeful because we will, we will innovate our way out of this problem. I'll say it's hopeful because we have gone through these collapses, and the civilization got smaller and less egotistical, and then it evolved back again. So I think we're at an arc. So that's my presentation. Thank you. Sorry it took so long.
Well, I'd like to thank Marc for an extraordinary presentation, very different from the one I saw in Northern Westchester. We'll have to invite you back to do one on art. Quite insightful and extremely thought-provoking, and if we're doing things right, action-provoking as well. Let me invite some questions and answers. Answers, we hope. Can I have that other mic? Thanks. And Jim first.
So yeah, wonderful presentation. It seems to me that with all these wonderful solutions, they don't seem to take into account the absolutely unrestrained population growth.
It's first thing my wife always says.
And what are we going to? We have too many people that are growing in number, and actually too much water to accommodate all these people.
And what they're eating. The water is also being used for what they're eating.
Yeah, and in some areas I know, especially shore areas that are being threatened by rising seas and climate change, the answer seems to be to build on stilts, pilings, and allow the water to flow underneath.
Yeah.
Rather than landfill out into the water.
So there are a couple questions. I want to get to them. But
all right. So
I don't forget them.
Yeah.
All right. So the first one in terms of population, because I taught in the sustainability program and I took that very seriously. You want to just get the mic? So there's two things. I used to say all the time that the number one thing to do to reduce population growth is educate women, because all the research shows that when women become educated, they have fewer, if no, children. And of course, we have a vast number of people on the planet, young women on the planet, who have no access to education whatsoever because of the war zones. 25% of the human population is at war right now. 25% of the entire human population, and but there's nobody going to school during war. Maybe some online, but it's not really going to school in the same way. So I'm not saying that's number one. I used to say that was number one, but then there's some research been shown that wouldn't necessarily be the thing that would population down. Poverty is really the number two. People who live in poverty tend to have more children. Not always, but that tends to be a driver of it. So if you equalized, and we have the wealth we have in North America and Dubai, and is so, like, when you look at the scale of it, like if you look closely at some of those charts, it's just completely off the charts. And the access we have to water and materials and everything. So that has to become equalized, and the population will decline. When people, so for instance, I studied in Italy in the 1990s, somebody who worked in a shoe store, a regular person who worked at a shoe store, had that job for 30 years. They weren't worried about their pension. They had a government pension. They weren't worried about medical care. They had government medical care. And they didn't have 5 kids. They had a very beautiful, elegant, simple life. They had a lot of vacation time. They had access to health care. They lived in nice houses on a modest salary as a shoe salesperson. And that was their career. And so I've seen it physically in places, and it's changed now because everything's run. We don't even have clerks anymore. We have self-checkout. That is an idea of technology that's become completely accessorized, and the amount of resources used to make that self-checkout machine is ridiculous. It's shipping it, and they're shipped back and forth, and we're shipping stones from India, and we're shipping coltan from out. It's crazy, really, when you think about it. They create a self-checkout machine, and then we have people who have no work to do, right? So that's the one part of the problem. The other problem in the Netherlands, with climate change, with increase, remember the Netherlands were the ones years and years ago were building dikes that were flexible. We still have all these engineers who are like, we need to build a seawall. The Army Corps of Engineers, we're going to build a bigger seawall. What happened in Hurricane Katrina showed that you build the seawall higher, The water's eventually going to get under it, around it, and now you're trapping the water in. So the Dutch a long time ago learned you build a flexible seawall, and so, but now they're saying, no, 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 we just move inland. Forget the seawall, the dikes. We're moving inland. And they're picking up entire towns and rebuilding them further inland. And of course, they're having to do that in Alaska because of permafrost melting. So that is part of the solution, and that's not reclaimed, that is building new houses, but in many cases they're actually taking down the buildings and rebuilding them if it makes sense to do so. And you really have to look at that cost-benefit analysis, because people always say it's too expensive to do that. Compared to what? It's cheap to go out to Home Depot or Lowe's and buy all these plastic products, but at what cost in the externalities? How much shipping was involved? You know, the trucks that are on the road. You go on the road now, the amount of trucks is just constant, especially on Long Island, it's just constant. All day through the night, there's just trucks running materials all the time, and Amazon. And so that's the cost of that cheap stuff, right? Is the subsidies of fossil fuels and the subsidy of the whole multinational, globalized, which I'm not an anti-multinationalist, but it is part of the problem, our notion that we're not going to use local solutions. So the housing looks the same everywhere, but it shouldn't. It should look different in different places. But 90% of the world's population is still living in houses made out of earth. So that's something to think about. Like, we're very small, we have a very narrow window on the world. You know, we see very little of what happens in the favelas and what happens in Africa and different really rural places. Even in China, there's still very rural places where people living in dirt housing. So.
Thanks. Gwen, go. Hold on, let me just give you the microphone. There you go.
Just something very quick. You had some great diagrams and things on there.
Yeah.
Are they on your website? Or
no, if you
I'm thinking
email
my
me,
son would be interested.
Yeah,
I'd like to show him.
Sure, I've got cards back there, like I said, that tell a little about me and some about my father. If you take one of those, you email me. I'm very accessible by email, and I'll send you the whole presentation.
Oh, great. Okay, that would be great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And we don't want to forget piano.
Go ahead.
Hello. I was just wondering, have you heard of the Line project by any chance?
No.
It's interesting what you said about like optimizing use of environments and also like what was some of the projects that we're developing in deserts. But there's this project called the Line project. I think it's funded by people in Dubai, though I'm not 100% sure. Mm-hmm. And the idea is to like have an optimal living arrangement. And it was kind of like the slide with like the green, I don't remember what you called it, with the green thing.
Yep.
So,
limousine green.
What was it?
Limousine green.
Limousine green. So I feel like I don't know the practicality of it, but I was just curious if you knew about it and if you thought that would be like helpful or harmful.
So I don't know the that particular project, but I believe his name is Michael Braungart. But anyway, there's a book called Cradle to Cradle, and it was part of this whole thinking that, and I'm not saying the Line project is directly related to that, but he started building those kinds of cities. Now there's lots of them in production. Like I said, China was building eco-cities. He did one in China. Interestingly, he took a community in China as his first test project. And this was a rural community that had lived, and the colonists lived like this. Many rural farmers live like this around the world. There was a forest that was shared in common, and they created their housing and their town. There's a way that towns evolved for most of human history and still evolve. You know, somebody goes and moves someplace and is a settler, and then there are a few settlers, and then somebody creates a general store kind of place where they can get access to materials, and then more people specialize, and it develops a community. That's the way communities evolve. Even in Queens, that happens with populations that come in. You know, there'll like be this general store that does all the financial trading, make phone calls back home, and you know, it's like it evolves to other stores, and it's how communities develop. So what happens with a lot of these projects is they're taking, and it happened with another project called Architecture of Humanity. They're taking outside experts and saying, this is how we're going to create the perfect society, without taking any of that process of evolution, of how those people create their own community. It's like, we're going to bring in the expert, we're going to bring the architect, we're going to bring the engineers, we're going to bring the urban planners, we're going to bring the psychologists, and we're going to show them how to live. That's not who human beings are. That's what housing projects were, that they're tearing down now all over North America. They're destroying housing projects, that the urban planners, the architects, everybody said, the Soviets, they said, everybody's going to have the same apartment. Doctor, politician, factory worker, they're all going to live in the same apartment with the same refrigerator. But people don't want to live that way. They want to have a pink refrigerator. So, you know, that's the problem. It's that hubris. It's that arrogance. It's that sense of like, we know better. And so what really needs to happen is these communities have to evolve organically. And I'm not saying throw out the baby with the bathwater. So what Architecture of Humanity tried to do before the two founders of Architecture of Humanity started embezzling money and the nonprofit failed, but what they originally tried to do before they got famous was they would go to a place that was desperate. The people were desperate. And they would say, well, we're not going to come in with any ideas. We're going to hire somebody who speaks that language. If we can't find anyone in that community, we're going to find the nearest person we can that's educated, that speaks that language, and we're going to have them live with them for a year. And then over the course of that year, find out what are the real source of the problems. Don't go in and say, like Madonna, and say, we're going to build women's schools. You know, that might be a solution, but they may need water more. So if you don't know, they built all these schools. I'm not saying Madonna, but it happened where they built all these schools, and then the girls weren't going to school, and they didn't know why, and it was because they had sanitary issues, and they were embarrassed to go in the bathroom because it was a huge deal in that culture to not know. So that made, you're just rushing in there as the expert and building something and saying we know how to do it. So they have a person live with them like an anthropologist for a whole year, and then try to get an architect from that culture or the closest culture to it to then spend time with that anthropologist or sociologist, and then develop the architectural scheme with the people. So that's a different notion than, because there's so many models. You can go all over the world and you'll see them. So anyway, the guy wrote Cradle to Cradle, did this city, went to a place where they had been harvesting wood for hundreds of years from this forest and building their houses out of it and mud. And he built them these green houses, and oddly, nobody there had ever had a car or needed one, but he built a garage in every house. They built the house out of industrial waste, which turned out to be toxic. Anyway, it's a complete fail. And he came up, it's a really good book to read, Cradle to Cradle, but that's the problem. He again came in as this kind of arrogant architect saying, I know how to solve the problems. So that's would be my reaction to it, even if I don't know that specific project. Don't forget piano.
Yeah, sorry, I know we're short on time, so I'll keep it quick. Thank you so much for that presentation. Just two quick things. I'm a huge prescriber to degrowth, but we've identified the problems and prospective solutions, but pragmatically speaking, when we have a global economic model that's about exponential growth, how do we get
it's not going to work.
Right.
So you see what's happening at the UN right now. If you haven't heard any of the discussions of the UN recently,
yes,
like everybody's
for Climate
questioning,
Week especially,
it's like, is it even relevant? It's not going to work based on growth. And the UN has even been saying, like, their answers have always been growth. And the IMF and the World Bank has always been, we're going to invest money, we're going to invest industry, we're going to teach the kids. You know, they teach the kids how to be computer engineers. There's not that many jobs for computer engineers in Tibet, you know, and then they become drug addicts. That's a literal thing that happened. Yeah. So that's the thing, is that paradigm. I remember a marine biologist who wants to build a seawall in the New York Harbor said the only way things are going to change is when millions of people start to die, which sounds very dark, and I'm not laughing because it's funny. I always just say you either laugh or cry, so you might as well laugh. But I think that's the problem, is like we're stuck in this paradigm that we're superior as a species, we know better, we know how to distill it, we'll always be an innovative way out of the problem. So degrowth is the completely opposite. And I've read for many years about utopian communities. There's problems with those because people are neurotic. Mm-hmm. No, that's really what the problem is the neuroses of people make it very difficult for us to form like really cohesive. So I would read The Dawn of Everything. It's a big book. It's a lot to take on. It's like 900 pages or something. But it's interesting because it is about all of these societies that evolved, that existed alongside the Incas, alongside the Egyptians, but didn't ascribe to, they would be like, oh yeah, we believe in the pharaoh, you know, and then they kind of did their own thing and lived very lightly on the land. So I don't know what the shifting, you know, there's all these, a student once told me, my generation, your generation, doesn't have any utopian images. We only have dystopian movies. We only have dystopian video games. Or they're like cartoony utopian things that aren't really that connected to the real world. So I think that's, what has to happen is somebody has to have this kind of utopian, this model will emerge out of the collapse. We haven't fully collapsed yet as a economic model, as a paradigm. And really think about the French, if you know about French colonialism, nobody thought it would collapse. If you lived in Egyptian times, they'd be like, the pharaoh, there's never going to collapse. Rome too, they'd be like, there's no way. I mean, Rome is the most, so it's like, I remember I was at a meeting, political meeting once, and the student said, well, can't you see that the cream always rises to the top? Like he really believed that. Sometimes it's not the cream that rises to the top. It's mold. So that's the thing. It's like we have to get out of that model that this is like, it's not going to change because it's always been this way. It has not always been this way.
So the second, like the latter half of that question was, my read of human history is that we keep tag teaming as different cultures rising to supremacy and thinking that we're exceptional.
Right.
So it's different cultures tag teaming throughout human time. So even if I do exist in a culture like the Incas where I'm existing well, flourishing, sustainable, relative to a superpower that's harming the environment,
Right.
like there's still going to be that group that emerges wanting to be
Yes,
exceptional.
and
So
that's
what do
what's
we
happening.
do?
That's what's happening. That's right now. Every African nation is making deals with the Chinese because they want to be the next big powerhouse. That's why there's all these Italians building a dam in Ethiopia because Ethiopia wants to be able to sell water to Egypt. That's the problem. I haven't studied. That's probably the next thing that I should study is how did these things happen after the collapse? Like the Dark Ages were, and I did in a little bit with studying William Morris. So the Dark Ages were really dark. I mean, it was bad. It was not a good time to live in the Dark Ages. There were some beneficent kings and queens, but mostly they were pretty barbaric. And out of the Dark Ages evolved this 19th century culture. So interesting to look at those shoulder, you know what I mean? Those time periods. And I don't know, I don't remember, I read The Dawn of Everything a long time ago, how much they talked about that. It'd be interesting to look at those, what were the thoughts and ideologies that were the reactions right after the collapse of these major civilizations, after Rome collapsed and after Greece collapsed. Like who were the people that were, and what were the ways that they were able to move society? So yeah, we need piano. I'll stick around, and people want to ask me questions, and you can always email me.
We have a question from Zoom.
Looking at the time right now, I think
Can we take one question from Zoom? Rich Askins has his hand up.
Okay, we can take, Rich had his hands up before. Okay, we can take one question from Zoom.
Thank you very much, everyone. Wonderful presentation. I agree with over 90% of it, which is about the highest honor I give anyone these days. You've done a lifetime of work, I would assume. It's wonderful. I do have one question about water. It's crazy how we use water, but I've read some articles over the past 10, 15 years, and this is certainly not a long-term solution, that desalination of water is getting cheaper and cheaper, and that might be a short-term or medium-term solution.
I'm glad you asked that question. Of course, that's what they're doing in Dubai and all these places. They're desalinizing water. There's no water underground they could get access to. It's actually very environmentally destructive to desalinate water at that scale. There was a whole plan. The guy was a Columbia professor, Dixon Despommier, very fancy name, came with this whole idea that we're going to solve all the world's food problems by having hydroponics in the desert. And then when they looked into the desalinizing, like the sheer volume of water and the amount of species that you're killing to just grow algae, because all water is full of microorganisms, many of which we don't even know exist yet. And you're really changing the balance. It's not adapting to the landscape. However, the amount of rainfall in many places on Earth and the amount of water that we waste, that we send directly down drains and out to the sea, is monumental. And I did have a permaculture teacher who did a huge project in Israel, and at first it was illegal. Everything he did to try to capture rainwater and use it for a farming project, everything he was doing was against the building codes. And then he got caught and he got fined, and they said, "Oh, wait a minute, that's a lot of water you're saving." And they actually hired him to work with the Israeli government. So that's the biggest problem, is the sheer amount. So I'm going to say something a little off color, but this is a direct quote from a student from Africa who came to Stony Brook University. I didn't meet him directly, but one of my students told me this. He came, on a visa program and everything, and he was shocked. He said, "You mean to tell me that you have so much drinking water here that you shit in it?" So that tells you a lot. And a lot of that water goes into a sewage treatment plant and then goes directly out into a waterway. So
Thank you very much.
John Todd was dealing with. So thank you.
So I'd like to thank Marc Fasanella for an extraordinarily informative and thought-provoking talk today.
To learn more about us, visit our website, ethicalfocus.org, or email us at admin@ ethicalfocus.org and we'll get back to you. To make a donation, go to ethicalfocus.org/donate. Please follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and you can watch many of our past programs on our YouTube channel.